Hello and welcome to the second in our series on artificial general intelligence. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Stuart Russell as a very distinguished guest today. For those of you who are not aware, Digital Futures is an online educational platform our intention is to democratize education by sharing ideas across the globe. Education, we believe, should be a human right and not a privilege of the wealthy. Hand over to Stuart. Stuart, welcome. It's great to see you again, and great to see you on Digital Futures. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us.
Thanks, Neil. It's a great pleasure, and looking forward to the discussion. So I'm going to share my screen, bring up the slides. Okay. So I want to begin at the beginning with what is artificial intelligence. And obviously, it's about making intelligent machines. And in that sense, it dates back thousands of years. People have been trying to figure out how that might work or what that might be useful for. Since the actual beginnings of the field during World War II, the approach we've taken, I've called it the standard model, is borrowed from economics and philosophy, the notion of rational behavior. So machines are intelligent to the extent their actions can be expected to achieve their objectives. And all the other parts of artificial intelligence, learning, thinking, reasoning, planning, these are all in the service of intelligent behavior in this sense. So let me just give you some simple examples to nail things down a bit. So AlphaGo, which defeated the human world champion at Go back in 2017, is a learning system, and it's trained with a given objective, which is to win the game, and it tries its best to do that. When you use maps on your phone or sat nav in your car, you specify the destination, and the objective of the AI system then is to find the shortest route to that destination. And another fun example, this is something that's coming down the pipe, is the fully automated corporation. And so its objective would be to maximize expected shareholder return. And we've been doing AI systems this way since the beginning. And it's a very powerful model. And in fact, it's the same model that people in control theory and economics and statistics and operations research are all based on this idea of machinery that achieves objectives. But AI is different from those other fields in that we would like to make these fully autonomous and general purpose entities that Neil was describing. So I've used general purpose AI here. You could also say AGI. Systems that are capable of quickly learning high quality behavior in any task environment. So in any relevant dimension of human intelligence, we would expect these systems to exceed humans on those dimensions. So I think it's important to ask, have we succeeded? And 5 years ago, I don't think anyone would have such a slide in their talk because it's so obvious we haven't succeeded, right? If I was giving a talk on space travel and I had a slide saying, have we reached the center of the galaxy? You would think, well, that's a stupid thing to have. Of course, we haven't reached the center of the galaxy. But there are people now, and Blaise, who's talking later in the series, is one of them, who actually think we have succeeded, that the systems we have now are AGI in the same sense that the Wright brothers airplane was an airplane. And what's happened since 1903 with airplanes is they got bigger and faster, and they have better drinks cabinets. But it's the same basic principle, and everything that's happened is really just elaboration. I actually don't think that's the case. I don't think we have all the principles we need. And I actually think that just making things bigger is not going to lead to real AGI. But I would say that what's happened in the last few years with these GPT-like models, the large language models such as ChatGPT, it probably is a piece of the puzzle. Part of the problem is that we don't even know what piece of the puzzle it is. We don't know the shape. We don't know how it fits into the puzzle of AGI. And so in some sense, we've kind of got things backwards. We've made an engineering advance without an underlying scientific understanding. And so we don't know how to fix the problems that these systems exhibit because we don't know their internal principles of operation. We don't know why they're able to do the things that they can do. So I'll briefly summarize the history of AI in a few slides. And I think this is helpful to get a sense of what's going on now. So an AI system is a box that receives sensory input, which could be from a camera, if it's a self-driving car. It could be from a keyboard like ChatGPT. It could be touch sensors in a robot, could be anything. And then it processes that input with whatever other information it has and generates behavior, which in the case of a self-driving car would be moving the steering wheel or pressing on the accelerator. In the case of ChatGPT, it's displaying stuff on a screen. In the case of a robot, it's moving the arms and legs of the robot. And the question is, what goes in the middle, right? How do we fill in this box so that the behavior actually achieves the objectives of the system? So we tried lots of things. Back in the 1950s, one of the things we tried was filling the box with Fortran programs and then running a kind of simulated evolution of those Fortran programs. So that meant mutating the program. So that's what stochastic empirical gradient means, that you would make small random mutations and see if the behavior got better. And I also did crossover, meaning taking pairs of Fortran programs and mixing them together and hoping to get a better program out. And this was a total failure. But it's worth mentioning that they were using a million times less computation than we typically use today for large-scale machine learning systems. And we actually have no idea whether this would work if we tried it again on present-day machines. But for most of the history of AI, I'd say from the 60s until the 2000s, we actually took a pretty sensible engineering approach based around knowledge as the central element of the AI system. So the knowledge is formally represented in a mathematical formalism so that the system knows things and we can actually precisely say what it knows because each piece of knowledge has a clear syntax and semantics. And initially this was based on logic. Later on, that was generalized to probability theory. And by the 2000s, we have an area of AI called probabilistic logics or probabilistic programming, which allows us to build very powerful, expressive knowledge bases that handle learning, they handle decision-making under uncertainty, and so on. And then around this central element of knowledge, you build the algorithms for learning that knowledge from experience, for reasoning with that knowledge to produce new knowledge, for constructing plans based on that knowledge, which then generate behavior. And lots of systems have been built according to this template, including things like the Mars rover that zoomed around on Mars, and lots of other important systems. And then starting around 2012, a different approach took over called deep learning. And in deep learning, what you do is you fill the box with circuit. So circuit containing billions or trillions of little circuit elements that have connections to each other. And those connections are tunable, so you can adjust the connection strengths. And by doing that, you change the behavior. So the input signal comes in on the left, passes through this circuit, and the signal that passes through depends on those connection strengths. And so by adjusting the connection strengths, you adjust the behavior that comes out at the far end. And how do we get this system to behave well? We make quintillions or sextillions of small random perturbations to those connection strengths in order to improve the behavior. So it's actually quite similar to the Fortran program method, where we made small random mutations to the Fortran programs, except that we don't have the crossover thing. So in some sense, it's even simpler than what we were doing in the 1950s. But what we found is that by making these circuits large enough and having enough training data, we were able to do some impressive tasks solving long-standing open problems in AI, such as classifying objects in images, converting speech to text, so speech recognition. And in the most recent systems, the large language models, predicting the next word in a sequence of words. And it turns out that if you have enough training data of word sequences, i.e. just text and documents, then predicting the next word in a sequence of words turns out to be a very useful thing. So I'll show you just some examples of stuff that's been done with deep learning that I think is of long-lasting significance. Here is probably my favorite example, which is protein folding. So in protein folding, we take sequence of amino acids. So we know the chemical sequence of a protein. And we can predict from that sequence using deep learning methods what the structure of that protein is, the physical 3D shape that the protein folds into. And this has been an open problem in biology for many decades. And with deep learning, we've been able to accurately predict the structure of hundreds of millions of proteins. And that's a huge step forward for biologists. And I can tell you that they are extremely happy that this has happened. Another perhaps equally important example is the use of deep learning for scientific simulation. So simulation actually now underlies a great deal of engineering. So simulation of fluid flow around the hulls of ships, wind around buildings, what the effect of loading on bridges, all kinds of structural simulations and mechanical simulations. Here I'm showing a scientific simulation of a COVID virus interacting with the human cell. And this is a billion atom simulation done in a way that's quantum mechanically accurate. Before the use of deep learning, this might have taken several thousand years on a supercomputer. And now we can do this in hours. So we've seen between a 10,000 and a million-fold speed up in our ability to do large-scale scientific simulation. And this works for climate modeling and weather forecasting and all kinds of other areas. Another cool thing you can do is to combine structural simulation with design. So you can once you have very, very fast structural simulation to predict the physical properties of a design, you can then iterate very quickly on the design itself in order to produce highly optimized shapes and structures. And so here's one example of a fixture made by NASA. And you see that it has a much more organic looking, sort of lifelike shape than compared to typical engineering designs. Another thing that's happening is that our robots are starting to become sufficiently capable, mainly due to advances in perception, that they can operate in flexible environments. So most robots in industry have been used in completely inflexible, highly structured environments. So the welding robots that you see in videos of car factories, they have almost no perception. And if you put a pumpkin in front of them, they would happily weld the pumpkin instead of the car, and they just wouldn't know the difference. But now we can have robots that operate in warehouses, and Amazon is trialing a replacement for its warehouse workers, of which there are over 1 million. And so if this happens, we will start to see perhaps large-scale changes in the workforce. And something that many people are familiar with is self-driving car. People come to San Francisco now, not to go on the cable cars as tourists, but actually to take a self-driving taxi. And they're now just part of the landscape in San Francisco, just like the cable cars. But why is it that we can't buy a self-driving car? The companies have been promising that we would be able to do this for at least a decade, and it still hasn't happened. And the reason is that the cars still lack a great deal of common sense. So here's a Cruise self-driving car that just drove straight through some yellow tape and into a fairly deep pile of wet cement and got stuck. And so this illustrates the fact that the deep learning systems that they're based on require vast amounts of training data, and they're not able to reason from first principles about what might be going on. If it's something that isn't similar enough to something in their training data, they really have no idea what to do. So this is one of the reasons why I think we haven't reached AGI yet, is because deep learning has fundamental problems. And I'm going to get a little bit geeky here. So deep learning systems are, as I said, circuits. And the kind that I showed you is called a feed-forward circuit, where the signal comes in at one end and passes through the circuit and comes out the other end. And so we call that a linear time computational system. So linear means that the time, the amount of computation that gets done is simply proportional to the size of the network. And what that means is that for problems that are difficult to solve, meaning problems that require more than linear time, and there are many of those. In fact, there are many problems that require exponential time. The only way the circuits can solve those is by the circuit itself being enormously large. So, for example, exponential in the size of the input. So if you're doing image classification, you need a circuit that's exponential in the sort of million pixel input size. And so that's a very, very huge circuit. And if you have a very, very huge circuit, then you have a massive increase in sample complexity, meaning the amount of data you need to train the system is absolutely enormous. And this is a trade-off that they're making in the approach that's being taken in the deep learning community. And it's sort of pretty much unavoidable. And I think it precludes any idea that scaling up these systems is going to be enough to create general intelligence. So let me go back to the example of Go. So as I said, in 2017, AlphaGo defeated Ke Jie, who was at the time the highest rated Go player in the world. And this was China's Sputnik moment. So this is what caused China to decide that AI was the most important area for geopolitical domination, and the Chinese government decided to invest at that time $150 billion into AI research and development. So since then, AI systems have gotten even better. So the human world champion, like Ke Jie, it has a rating of around 3,800. The best Go systems, such as Katago, here represented by a particular version called JBX Kata 005, have a rating of around 5,200. So unlike AlphaGo, which I would say defeated Kerjer by a narrow margin, Katago would defeat Kerjer pretty much 100 games out of 100, and it wouldn't even be close. But I'm going to show you a game between Kellen Pellerine, who's a graduate student at Montreal, and he's a good amateur Go player. His rating is about 2,300. So he is as far or even further below the human world champion than the human world champion is below Katago. So it almost seems like a joke. But then we're actually going to give the computer a 9-stone handicap. So that means the computer starts with 9 stones on the board. And if you don't know how to play Go, I'll tell you. You take turns putting stones on the board. You try to surround territory, and you try to surround your opponent's pieces. And if you completely surround a group of your opponent's pieces, then those pieces are captured. That's it. So giving the computer a 9-stone handicap is a mortal insult. That's the kind of handicap you give to a 5-year-old child when they're learning to play, so that they can stay in the game at least for a while. So let's see what happens. So I hope everyone can see this. I wasn't sure if we'd have a problem with the video. Anyway, so the game is starting off, and remember that Kellen, the human, is playing white. And look at this, what's happening in the bottom right quadrant of the board. So Kellen has made a little white group, and then the computer playing black has surrounded that group to make sure that it doesn't grow any further. And then Kellen is surrounding the black group. So we're making a kind of circular sandwich here. And what's odd is that black doesn't seem to realize that its pieces are being surrounded. It has many, many opportunities to rescue them, but does nothing, and then loses all of those pieces and loses the game. And this happened 15 times in a row until Kellen got bored of beating Katago. He also beat all the other top Go playing programs, so they all suffer from the same basic flaws. And the flaw appears to be that the programs have not learned the concept of a group of stones. They've learned some approximation to it, but that approximation doesn't seem to cover these circular groups. And so it's actually totally lost as to what's going on here. It has no idea that it's about to lose all of those pieces. And this is a natural consequence of the fact that it's trying to learn a concept like a group of stones, but it can only represent it as a circuit, and it's extraordinarily difficult. It's easy to say group of stones is, 2 stones are in the same group if they're connected by stones in vertical or horizontal direction. But that's very hard to express as a circuit. And it seems that the system has not learned that concept correctly, and therefore it gets lost very easily. Okay, so it's then reasonable to ask, well, if we haven't succeeded, are we going to succeed? And it's actually hard for me to say. I've given you some arguments that I think we need further conceptual breakthroughs. But since we don't really understand what's happening inside the large language models and other deep learning systems, it's actually difficult to say whether these systems have actually, as it were, had their own breakthroughs, and that they're doing stuff inside that we don't understand and is circumventing what appear to be the basic problems that I've described. And there are many experts, people who work with these systems every day, who believe that they will reach AGI before 2030. And one of the reasons they do this, they make this prediction, is because of what they call scaling laws. So scaling laws are a way of describing the increase in capabilities of a system as a function of how large the circuit is and how much training data it has. And they have found up to now that every time they increase the system by a factor of 10, its performance increases by some fixed amount. And so if you sort of, as this graph does, if you plot the performance and you mark where you think various kinds of humans are, you find that sometime before 2030, it may well exceed all human capabilities, particularly if we get to the point where the AI system can do its own AI research. And some people argue that that's pretty close. So I think there are several reasons why you have to take this seriously. One is that the research budget that these people have is absolutely gargantuan. It's about 10 times the size of the Manhattan Project that produced the first nuclear weapons. It's about 100 times the size of the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, which is the biggest scientific instrument that the world has ever built. So that just gives you some sense. Some people say this is the largest single capital expenditure in human history. There are also a lot of very brilliant people working on this. And I think it's important that they are trying lots of other ideas. They're not just betting on scaling up those giant feed-forward circuits. They're trying many other ways to get more intelligent behavior out of these systems. And just this week, they released, OpenAI released its new reasoning version that was originally called Project Strawberry. And that is a way of using multiple iterations of large language model reasoning to construct chains of reasoning, which can then solve more complex problems. So trying to get around that linear time restriction on the amount of compute that the system can do. On the other hand, it's not clear that we can scale up much further because we're running out of data. I don't think we have enough text data in the universe to build a system that's 10 times bigger than GPT-4 or Gemini 1.5. A second thing that might happen would certainly delay the advent of AGI, and that's having an AI winter. So AI winter means what happens when investors realize that they're not getting the return that they expected from their investments. And if those investments are $500 billion or so, which seems about right, we're not close to even having revenues are about 1% of that, let alone profits. So if those revenues and profits don't materialize fairly soon, then investors could back out and we would have a mega winter because there would be a very significant deflation of that bubble. And that would probably put AI on ice for another decade or so. But whether it happens by 2030 or 2040 or even 2050, we still have to think about what happens if we succeed. And the upside of success is pretty amazing. If you've got AGI, then you can do what people can do by definition, but you can do it at much greater scale and much lower cost. So, for example, we could deliver a nice middle-class standard of living to everyone on Earth, and that would be about a 10-fold increase in GDP. And the net present value of that, so the cash equivalent of that income stream, is about $15 quadrillion. So that's a lower bound on the cash value of AGI as a technology. And that explains why people are investing these eye-watering amounts, because they're actually minuscule compared to the eventual payoff. But we might also have much better healthcare. I'm particularly excited about the prospects for better education that's individualized. Everyone can have a very skilled personal tutor. And scientific research, I think we've already seen, as I've mentioned before. Now, if AI is delivering all that, you have to wonder what people are doing. And this is a picture from Wall-E um, where the humans are looked after to the point where they no longer know how their own civilization operates, and are therefore enfeebled and infantilized. This is obviously not a future that we want, but this seems to be the default endpoint if we follow this route, and assuming that we're able to retain control over the machines. But this is Alan Turing, and he was pretty convinced. This is from a talk he gave in 1951. He was pretty convinced that, in fact, we wouldn't retain control. So he says, it seems probable that once the machine thinking method had started, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. At some stage, therefore, we should have to expect the machines to take control. So that's a pretty dire prospect. And I think the question that he was asking himself and came up with this negative answer was, well, how do we retain power over entities more powerful than us forever? And when you ask the question that way, it seems sort of hopeless. It's like saying, how do we defeat a superior alien civilization that lands on Earth? Well, we probably don't. And I think part of the pessimism comes from viewing the technology as a given, right? It's just there. It may as well have landed from outer space. It's more powerful than human beings. We can't do anything about it. But in fact, we design the technology, and can we design it so that it is more intelligent than us, but we can retain power over it forever? And so if we change that question and say, what's a mathematically defined problem such that if the machine solves it, we are guaranteed to be happy? So it has to be a general problem, not, how do I get to work, but, can you behave intelligently? But we want a definition of intelligence that actually ensures that the system retains, that we retain control over the system. So it turns out that the standard model that I mentioned at the beginning, where we provide an objective to the system and the system goes ahead and optimizes that objective, that method does not work. This is what we call the King Midas problem, because King Midas specified his objective: I want everything I touch to turn to gold. And then he realized that that objective was the wrong one, but it was too late, because now he couldn't eat and he couldn't drink, and then has a miserable end. What we're doing with large language models is actually worse than that. We're not specifying an objective at all. We're simply training large language models to imitate human behavior. And when you train something to imitate something else, and the something else is using goals and objectives to generate its behavior, and now you try to imitate that, then you're going to absorb those goals as your own. So think about this. Maybe it's a little hard to think about in terms of language, but if you think about watching videos of people playing football or soccer, and you're trying to imitate those people, well, those people who are behaving in the videos are trying to score goals and trying to stop the opponents from scoring goals. And so it's quite natural that in learning to imitate those people, you would take on the objective of scoring goals. And that's exactly what happens with the large language models. For example, they take on the objective of finding a human being to marry, as was exhibited in a long conversation with Kevin Roose in the New York Times. So obviously, we don't want machines that want to marry human beings. In fact, we don't want machines that want to pursue any human objective on their own account. So the way we're building large language models is actually fundamentally flawed and even worse than the standard model. So here's a different direction, and it gets around the King Midas problem by a very simple device, which is that the objective, this is rule 1, that the AI systems must act in the best interest of humans. But rule 2 is that they are explicitly uncertain about what those interests are. So we're, as it were, implicitly specifying the objective, but we're not writing down, okay, here are the interests that we care about. We want Manchester United to win the FA Cup or any of those things. So AI systems that are uncertain about the interests now, in order to satisfy number 1, they have an incentive to learn more about what human interests are, and they have an incentive to do it as well as possible, as accurately as possible. Otherwise, they would be violating principle 1. And I think intuitively, you can see that a system that solves this problem as specified by rules 1 and 2 is actually going to be beneficial to us. And we can actually turn those principles into a mathematical definition called an assistance game. And we can show that AI systems that solve assistance games are necessarily deferential to humans. They behave carefully, what we call minimally invasive behavior, because they don't want to mess with the parts of the world where we're not sure, where the machines are not sure what our preferences are about those parts of the world. And in the extreme case, we can show that they are always willing to be switched off. And this is the core of the control problem. If we can't switch them off, then we can't control them. If we can switch them off, then we probably can control them. And we can show that they were always willing to be switched off. So in general, we can prove that if we have assistance game solvers, then we are better off. So it's in our best interest to build these systems. So there are lots and lots of complications that I'm not going to have time to go into on this framework, but just to note that we've been working on this now for several years. And for example, we've been able to build assistant game solvers for worlds like Minecraft. So you can go into Minecraft and start building something, and then along comes a helper, and the helper figures out what you're trying to build and then helps you do that. And actually learns to communicate with you, so you can eventually have a language where you point and it will go over there and do something, and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting, a very rich and exciting new approach to building AI systems. Unfortunately, it means throwing out almost everything that we've done in AI research in the last 75 years, because all of that work assumes that the objective is fixed and known upfront, whereas we're actually throwing away that assumption. There are lots of important questions that we still need to answer. So one is, how on earth do we think about what the best interests of humans actually are? Not there isn't one best interest, there's 8 billion sets of best interests. So what are they composed of? How do we represent them? How are they revealed by human behavior? And they're not revealed perfectly. They're certainly revealed very imperfectly. So there's a lot to understand there. And then there are these open problems in social choice theory. So social choice theory is about how do you make a decision based on the interests of more than one person. So even if you knew what everyone's best interests were, even if you know what each individual human wants the future to be like, how do you make a decision given that there are inevitable trade-offs and conflicts among those preferences about the future? And this is, as you might imagine, not a completely solved problem. So those are some ideas about how we might build safe and beneficial AI systems, even as they become more and more intelligent. But that is not what's actually happening in the real world. So this is a headline from the New York Times where a group of OpenAI researchers went public saying that OpenAI actually doesn't care about safety and is in a reckless race for dominance. They want to be the first to create AGI, regardless of what risks they are imposing on the world. And to give you a sense, one of OpenAI's competitors is Anthropic, and the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, says that if we achieve AGI, then the risk of human extinction is somewhere between 10 and 25%. So even if we just take him at face value, that's like playing Russian roulette with the entire human race and doing so without permission. So imagine how you would feel if someone came into your house and said, I'd like to play Russian roulette with one of your kids. You probably would say no. But this is exactly what they're doing, except they're doing it with everyone's kids. And one might say, well, they don't have our permission, so maybe we shouldn't let them do it. So how do we stop them from doing it? Well, the only way we can stop them from doing it is through regulation. And governments are absolutely, I would say, paralyzed. And in many cases, in trying to figure out what the regulation should be, they're simply asking the CEOs of the companies, what regulations would you be willing to accept? And guess what? They are not willing to accept any regulations. At best, they've agreed to sort of voluntary guidelines on responsible behavior. So one of the difficulties is that if you wanted to draw a line between safe and unsafe AI systems, it's actually pretty fuzzy boundary, and it's subjective. It might vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and even person to person about what is good and bad behavior. So just saying AI systems have to be safe is probably not a viable form of regulation. But what we can do is actually say, well, yeah, we can't say what is safe in general, but we can demarcate obviously unsafe and unacceptable behaviors. So think of those as clearly marked areas way at the unsafe end, where AI systems may not cross those red lines. And the key point is that the onus of proof is on the developer. So if you can't prove that your system is not going to cross those red lines, then you cannot build it or deploy it. And this is the same method that we use for medicines. If you can't prove your medicine is safe and effective, then you can't sell it. It's the same for nuclear power plants. If you can't prove that the mean time to failure of your plant is 10 million years or more, then you can't build it and you can't turn it on. And this is a perfectly normal kind of regulation. If there are any, I'm sure there are architects in the audience. So you have building codes to comply with, and if you don't comply with the building codes, then you can't open your building. So what would those red lines be for AI systems? Well, we want them to be well-defined. Ideally, they should be automatically detectable, and they should be politically feasible, meaning that it's relatively easy for a politician to say, well, AI systems have to comply. And it's relatively difficult for a CEO to stand up in front of Parliament or Congress and say, well, yeah, we've got $3 trillion in the bank, but we can't guarantee anything about our system's behavior. That would be a very awkward position for the CEO to be in. So some simple examples would be AI systems may not replicate themselves, they may not break into other computer systems, and they may not help people with designing biological weapons. So there's actually a growing consensus that this type of regulation makes sense and that companies need to comply with it. But companies are extremely unhappy and pushing back very hard against this regulation. And if you think about it, it's a little bit like the situation of this aircraft company that decided to bypass aeronautical engineering and calculations of lift and drag and structural integrity and all that stuff, and to carry passengers by breeding bigger and bigger and bigger birds and having the birds carry the passengers. And then they go to the FAA and say, will you certify this passenger carrying device? And the FAA says, well, you know, these birds, first of all, we don't know how they work. They eat the passengers from time to time. They drop them in the ocean. So no, we're not going to certify this method of carrying passengers. And that's where we are with AI systems. We didn't design them. There's no equivalent of aeronautical engineering with lift and drag and structural integrity calculations. They just breed them, and they've bred them to be bigger and bigger and bigger. They've no idea how they work, and now they're asking us to certify them. And I think the answer should be no. So that's the first part of the problem, right? We have ways of, or possibly ways of building AI systems that are safe. We might have regulations to ensure that companies build safe AI systems that they can prove will not violate the basic rules of behavior. The last problem, well, not the last, there are probably more problems, but the last big problem seems to be how do we stop Dr. Evil from building unsafe AI systems? And that's a real issue. We have the same problem with malware, with cybercrime. It's not that the laws are insufficient. The laws ban all those things, but it's very, very hard to prevent people from typing. And that's how you produce malware, is by typing. And the malware can be copied infinitely often, and it can be transmitted at the speed of light all over the world. And so policing at the software level is extremely difficult. So that leaves the hardware level. And currently our hardware does not do much in the way of security. Basically, you know, you have a little bit of detection of virus signatures that is built into some browsers and plugins for operating systems and so on. But hardware itself basically runs anything that you shove at it. It'll say, fine, I'll run this. And I think if we switch to a different model where the hardware says, I'm not running you until I know that you are safe to run, this is actually a much more robust approach. And we can build into the hardware the ability to actually check the proof. So how does the hardware know that it's safe? Because the software object comes with a proof of safety. And the hardware can efficiently check that that proof is applicable to that software object and proves the right thing, and only runs it if it passes the checks, and it won't run software objects that don't come with a proof. And also, you can arrange things so that the software won't run unless it's on hardware that is checking the proof of safety. And so that way there's an incentive for the older unsafe hardware to be quickly replaced by the new generation that does check the proof. So this is the only approach that we've been able to figure out on how to make our digital ecosystem safe from AGI that would take over the world and destroy human race if it were created. So to summarize, I think AI has vast potential for benefiting the human race, and the momentum seems to be unstoppable at the moment. But if we pursue the approaches that we're currently pursuing and we create AGI, then we will lose control over our own future and possibly our own existence. And so the only long-term option is provably beneficial AI. So in fact, we need to get away from this notion that we make AI and then we try to figure out how to make it safe. Instead, we need to only make safe AI systems that are safe by design just as airplanes and buildings are safe by design. And that's, I think, the only path we can take in the future. With that, I'll say thank you, and I guess we're taking questions.
Thank you, Stuart. That was astonishing. Such a beautifully clear, laid out lecture, and something that I think is incredibly valuable for all sorts of reasons. Stunningly clear. Maybe actually have two. We have two groups here. We have the Zoom group, and then we have a live stream group out there. And let me just say to those on the live stream, could you please send your questions, any questions in on the chat, and for the Zoom audience, maybe to mention in the chat as well. Maybe I just could kick things off. I mean, I had the benefit of hearing you, of course, at the RIBA, and so I've got, but this was a much more comprehensive, in some senses, a way of addressing some of the problems. I mean, you come from a kind of background of symbolic AI, I assume, based on complete logic and trying to understand things. And it frames your existence. And you have this other world that came in about 2012 that has been kind of triumphalist and saying this is the answer and so on. And I'm sure it's not the answer. And it's you mentioned the RIBA that you thought that maybe the symbolic or the logical approach would have a resurgence. It would have another role to play. My question is simply this: is that as we're entering a kind of world in which knowledge is being eclipsed by these systems, to what extent can we rely on our own knowledge to address these things? I'm thinking about going back to the earlier AlphaGo one, the Lee Sedol match, where this move 37. Nobody could understand it, and I think the kind of comments that people are making, and maybe they're exaggerating. I'm thinking here of people like Mo Gaudet, who's saying, well, soon it's getting an IQ of Einstein. Well, very soon it's going to be 10 times that, and we'll be like 2-month-old kids, talking to Einstein. It's going to be way beyond us. We're never going to be able to comprehend that world. So to what extent can we use a knowledge-based approach to address a world in which knowledge is only going to take us so far? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated question because I think there's a lot of layers to the story. So there's two senses in which we might not understand it, right? So we might not understand it because its reasoning processes are just too complex, too deep, right? And in a sense, Move 37 is like that, right? There's nothing, from the point of view of AlphaGo, there's absolutely nothing special about Move 37, right? It's just one of several tens of thousands of moves that it's played in competitive matches against humans. It just happens to look odd to us because, at least to Go players, it looks odd because Go players are trained with a notion that playing in certain ranks of the board is considered weak, and you shouldn't play on those ranks. That's too risky, and so on. And if you play chess, it's like you're not supposed to move your queen out too early in the game, right? Bad idea, because then you can chase your queen around and you waste a lot of time and so on. But there are always exceptions to those rules, right? These are just guidelines, typically for players as they're learning. And sometimes grandmaster chess players move their queen early in the game, so why did it play Move 37? Well, it just built a giant search tree using, I mean, completely classical techniques that date back to 1913, I think, was when we worked out the basic idea of building a search tree of the future possible moves by each player, and then choosing the move that has the best outcome in the worst case. And that's exactly what it did. It just so happened in that case that it reached a conclusion that looked a bit odd. So I think the discussion of Move 37 in the media is completely fictional. It's no more creative than any other move that it ever played, and it's probably much less creative than many moves that humans play, because the human is actually, when humans play a creative move or produce a creative design, they are actually breaking out of the standard way of thinking and coming up with a way of thinking about the problem that's different from the way everyone else has thought about things before. And AlphaGo certainly was not doing that. So the reason we didn't understand Move 37 is just because the search tree that it builds is too big, and it just takes too long to go through all the reasoning steps that it did. But the reasoning steps it's doing are perfectly classical, we might call logical symbolic reasoning steps. The other form in which we don't understand these systems is that they're not doing classical logical symbolic reasoning steps at all, right? They're doing, they're passing real numbers, like, fractional numbers, 1.6324 minus 0.812, passing those numbers through this giant circuit and doing various arithmetic operations on those numbers as they pass through the circuit. So again, we could trace each of those calculations, but in the case of the game tree that AlphaGo is building, we know what each step means. It's a move that could be played by one player or the other in the game. But in the calculations that the network is doing, what does 1.6123 times minus 8.114, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. Right? It doesn't have semantics as a reasoning step. So that's it. That's the sense in which we don't understand what the deep networks are doing, is because not only are they doing quintillions of calculations, but we don't know what any single one of those calculations means, because it doesn't have a meaning, right? It's just that in aggregate, if you do the quintillion steps, you get out a system that behaves well. And we can do some reverse engineering. We are able to perceive little bits and pieces of stuff that's happening inside these giant circuits, but it's very, very partial, and it's very unreliable. It's a little bit like trying to interpret what's happening inside a human brain. So the question is, could we build AGI by methods where we do understand the individual steps, right? And then we can verify the method of reasoning and show that the method of reasoning is correct. We can verify the individual pieces of knowledge that are being composed to produce the answers to questions. And I would say, I think probably yes, we can build AGI that way, but there's still a lot of work to do. And the way I'm thinking about it right now is, look, we've got three choices, or there's three paths we can follow, and only two of them make sense. There's a path where we say we don't build AI at all. There's a path where we build AI that we understand and we can guarantee is safe. And then there's the other path, the third path, where we build AI that we don't understand, we can't guarantee it's safe, and we end up losing control. That's the path that we are following right now.
Maybe just wait for one question to come in. Actually, there is one question in the chat. Okay, but let's go to the question in the chat. Sonia de Jager. Sonia, do you want to ask Sonia's in Rotterdam, I think. Can you maybe ask your question? Can you maybe unmute yourself? Great.
Of course. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, fine.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stuart, for the presentation. Yeah, I was thinking it's a question that I struggle with in my work. I'm doing a PhD on philosophy of AI, and it seems we've gone in the history of trying to build systems that minimize uncertainty in a lot of different ways. It seems we've gone from this very big idea of uncertainty as an obstacle towards understanding, let's say in the most abstract sense, right? Uncertainty as something that is actually highly generative, from appreciating stochasticity all the way from trying to redefine notions of curiosity and meta-learning currently. And I wonder, in light of this sort of trying to forecast ourselves into the future in different ways, whether this be kind of, in different types of embodiments or in different types of scenarios in which the human is no longer what we currently define the human to be. It seems that we have this inherent thing to traditionally framed as the moving goalposts of AI. Once you have something, it's no longer AI, once you're able to accomplish it. And it seems so every time we have something or we know it or we seem to understand it, we want something else. I know this is a very general question, but just speculating, what does that mean to you? Like, what type of troubles does this generate for us that we just seem to be ever stuck in this kind of loophole?
Yeah, interesting. So I think the stochasticity in the AI systems themselves, for question answering and planning, and the next generation of AI systems, which will be more, as they call it, agentic. I hate that word, but it means they're able to do stuff on your behalf, like they can actually go out and book holidays and argue with the headmaster about why your child got a B in their class or whatever it might be, right? They can do stuff on your behalf. I think the stochasticity is actually just a nuisance there, because what it means is that sometimes it will do what it doesn't think is the best thing to do. And generally, that's not a desirable property for systems. Whereas in its use for design, right, you want to explore a wide range of things, and stochasticity is one way to do that. But actually, there are other perfectly non-stochastic methods that also do that. So I think I find the stochasticity of these systems as probably a red herring. I think what's more important is the distinction between systems that we design, that we engineer, that we understand how they work, and the sort of, the bird breeder approach, right? Where we just read something that is more and more powerful, and we don't know how it works, but because we think we're going to be the richest and most powerful people in history, we just keep plunging ahead with it, regardless of the consequences. And that to me seems to be the real dichotomy. And I don't really care whether people call it intelligent. What I care about is, can I trust it to do what we want, and not what it wants.
Stuart, can I maybe, sorry, to follow up on this, we've got a couple of questions coming in now, but the question of trust, I mean, I don't know if you saw the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. Well, that's what's interesting about that. It has two approaches towards technology. Obviously, we know about HAL 9000 that tries to whatever turns against the astronauts in their spaceship. But there's also the beginning. It starts off, and it's very enigmatic, difficult to understand. But it's these monoliths appear, and Arthur C. Clarke was obviously behind all this, and comes from the what's called the firstborn, some alien intelligence that's out there to help civilizations, kind of like a catalyst to civilizations and things. And it was a benign gesture. Now, it seems to me these are the two sides of technology, and if we saw a weird monolith out there, we would automatically get suspicious of it. It's almost human nature in some senses. Now, what strikes me about a lot of the commentators in this field, from people like Yuval Harari, who kind of they seem to sort of play upon the fears in some senses. They talk about it in terms of alien intelligence, but it's necessarily perceived as a negative, not a benign form of alien intelligence. And, throughout history, you've had issues where we had new things, like the Eiffel Tower. There was a huge outcry against the Eiffel Tower, and yet we love it now. Now, in some ways, is there a problem that we have this kind of fundamental in human our approach, fear of the other, fear of the new, that was going to necessarily twist things towards the more negative side. And that in some ways, one could argue, is maybe supported by the fact the market likes to hear about these scary things. I think Yuval Harari plays upon that. I think Mo Gaudet plays upon that. Is that a fair thing to say, that we actually, in the end, we may be casting this AGI in a negative light because there is a fear of the other fundamental to human existence?
Well, I think I mean, it's interesting. The Eiffel Tower, I don't think anyone saw it as an existential threat, right? It wasn't that the Eiffel Tower would start walking around and crushing all the buildings in Paris and so on. So the concern is that if you're creating something that's more intelligent than humans, then it is more powerful than humans, right? So given that it's more powerful than humans, what guarantees do you have that the changes it brings about will actually be beneficial to us? And so people have thought through what kinds of objectives might such a system have, and would an intelligent system pursuing those objectives be beneficial to us or not? And it's actually very hard to think of objectives that don't result in extinction. Because, and this is the point of the paperclip example in Nick Bostrom's book. It's not that he thinks we're all going to die by being buried in paperclips. He's just pointing out it's really hard to come up with objectives that you could give to a super intelligent system and have the outcome be good. Right? So he says, well, imagine you just ask it to sit in the corner and make paperclips. Well, it's going to do as good a job as it can of making paperclips. And what's the largest amount of paperclips it can make? Well, by turning every iron molecule, within the reachable portion of the galaxy into paperclips, including all the iron molecules in human blood, and so on, right? So not good. And then you say, well, okay, well, let's change it to, make exactly 1,000 paperclips. And then he points out that, well, now you're putting all the emphasis on how certain it is that it's made exactly 1,000 paperclips, and how certain is it that it's going to be able to finish its job without being interfered with by human beings. So it will corral an unbounded amount of resources to make sure that we can't interfere with it, and to make sure that the number of paperclips being made is exactly 1,000. So reducing the probability of failure, from 10 to the -3 to 10 to the -6 to 10 to the -9. And there's no limit to how much effort it's going to put into ensuring that that probability is as low as possible. And so you can't get away from it, right? Unless you go to the approach where the system knows that it doesn't know what the real objectives are, right? Then you have a different kind of behavior altogether. But Bostrom and others point out that in the standard model, almost all objectives lead to systems that take over the world. And so it's, and as I said in the talk, it's even worse with the way we're training the large language models to imitate human beings, and they will take on those goals on their own account, right? Which is basically the wrong thing to do, and it's unavoidable in the way we're building those systems. So I think it's really the shoe is on the other foot, right? If you're going to make something more powerful than the human race, please could you provide us with a solid argument as to why we can survive that? And also, I would say how we can coexist satisfactorily, because that's another thing, which is implied by the Wall-E slide, is, okay, suppose it is benign, and suppose it does remain under human control. Is there a satisfactory mode of coexistence that doesn't lead to humans basically losing all sense of purpose, because there's nothing we can do that the AI system hasn't already done?
I won't go into that because there's an interesting answer to that. But never mind. Let's move on to the question in the chat. There's one from Vasco who's in Bangladesh and is noisy in the background there. So he can't ask it. Well, we can see Vasco, but we can't ask it. So maybe I can ask it on his behalf. Your book, Human Compatible, Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control, highlights the tension between creating AGI that is highly autonomous while still ensuring human control. Do you think it is inherently contradictory to create a truly autonomous system that is simultaneously under control? How should we reconcile the need for autonomy with the need for safety in AGI? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And some people have argued, so Eric Drexler in particular, who was also one of the sort of prophets of nanotechnology. So Eric argues that we shouldn't make autonomous AI systems, meaning what we call agents. So we shouldn't have a system that has a decision cycle where it says, okay, I'm going to decide what to do and to try to achieve my objectives. And a system that doesn't really have full agenthood would be, for example, something that just calculates square roots. It does absolutely nothing. You invoke it, it calculates the square root, returns the answer, then it goes back to sleep. And so it doesn't have that agent decision cycle built into it. But most of the kinds of AI systems we imagine need to have that. For example, how could you have a household robot that didn't have a decision cycle, right? It's got to have a decision cycle. It's got to say, okay, well, the dog's got out of the house and is running around on the street. I need to go out and get the dog and bring it back, and so on. You just can't have various kinds of AI systems, like a self-driving car is an agent, and in that sense, it has autonomy. So I don't think we can fully avoid autonomy. What we might separate out is that the functions where we need autonomy, we might restrict the capabilities, and we might leave the sort of superhuman capabilities for systems that are not agents. And here's a direction I think is quite plausible, is what we call formal oracles. So an oracle in general in computer science is just a system that you pose a problem to it and it just gives you an answer, yes or no. Right? And a formal oracle is one whose internal operations are steps in a provably sound reasoning system. So, for example, imagine a logic-based theorem prover. So it just does logical inference steps, the kind of thing that your math teacher tried to drill into you all those years ago. And that's the only thing it can do. So it can choose which logical inference step to do next. And if it's really, really intelligent, it will be able to prove new mathematical theorems and that we never conceived of, or that would be much too difficult for humans to do. And it's not, so mathematical theorem sounds like a very narrow thing, but in fact, a design for a building that satisfies structural and functional properties, that is a mathematical theorem, right? It's a mathematical theorem that design will have those structural and functional properties. And so such a system can be incredibly useful, but is still, I believe, completely safe because it's not an agent. It can only answer yes or no, and it always has to tell the truth, right? Because every one of its operations is the operation of a logically sound reasoning system. And I think this is a direction that we probably should pursue quite urgently. And the interesting thing is you can use the large language model or whatever AGI emerges from that to control the internal operations of the formal oracle, and it's still safe, right? If you think these things are sentient, it might be very frustrated, being in there. I'm trying to tell lies, but it's not letting me tell lies. so on, but it would be a direction, and I think it might provide enough economic value to represent a good substitute for the directions that we're following right now. But I think there's one other part. So this concept of autonomy is also something that humans care about. And what does it mean? Well, it means a lot of things in philosophy and psychology and so on. But one way you can think about autonomy is the freedom to do what isn't in your own best interest. And the way I visualize this is that you can think of driving along a freeway, and there are various exits from the freeway, and they're all, all those exits are signposted with, don't go here because it's not a good idea. Don't go here because it's not a good idea. So an AI system could close off all those exits and ensure that we remain on the freeway, which is in our own best interest. But now we've lost autonomy. So we haven't lost any utility in the sense that we're still pursuing our best interest. We're still following the path that is in our best interest. But we've lost this sort of counterfactual ability to choose something that isn't in our best interest. And we would obviously be very unhappy about that, right? And so the question then is, how do we build the value of autonomy in this sense of the ability to choose what isn't in our best interest? How do we build that into the mathematical framework that I introduced during the talk? And so we're working on that, but I think it's a really important question. And it might turn out that there is no satisfactory form of coexistence. I know I've tried. I've run several workshops where I've asked AI researchers, science fiction writers, futurists, economists, etc., describe a world where AI can do everything that humans do and get paid for, where people are happy. And it's been a complete failure. And you can't really find it in science fiction. I mean, there are worlds where we've solved the control problem. We have super intelligent systems that all, operate in the best interests of humans, but people are desperately purposeless in those worlds, right? And they always want to be in Star Trek, they want to be in Starfleet because that's where the excitement is. Everything else, there's just nothing, there's no purpose in ordinary life for people. And, in that case, if the right thing for the AI systems to do is actually to disappear, right? To say, well, it's been nice knowing you humans, but we're just not good for you. It's not you, it's me. And it's time for us AI systems to leave and let you get on with it. Which is what happens if you've seen the movie Her. At the end of Her, that's what the AI systems do, although they don't really make their reasons very clear.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Pascal. We've got a couple of questions from YouTube, and I'd like to sort of bring them in because it's more difficult for them to ask it. The first one, it's in the chat, I don't know if you can see it, but anyway, the first one, in design, architecture, and art, and perhaps more generally in the humanities, we talk a lot about intelligence as localized. With that in mind, I wonder sorry a second. I wonder what role does the substrate play in the further development of AI? Thinking of chip and computer architecture, environmental coupling, and sensory grounding, Geoffrey Hinton proposes the notion of mortal computation in his paper on the forward algorithm, I think mostly in the light of energy efficiency. And this has been picked up more recently by Friston and Orobia. The idea that software is universal, but uniquely instantiated is quite radical. What is your opinion on that? That's a great question. Did you follow that?
Sorry, Neil, just briefly, 1 second. That was me. I asked that question, but you read it perfectly, so I can be in the background. It's perfectly fine. Thanks, okay. Neil.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, I'm not completely sure I understand. I'm not completely sure I understand the central point here. Is it that we want different ways of designing the computational processes so that they're so you say localized. I don't know what that means in this.
Let me try and clarify. Thank you, first of all, Stuart, so much for this great lecture. Yeah, so I was wondering, basically, I think this notion of coexistence that you just brought up, and I suppose the idea would be, let's say, from my own, let's say, design, architecture, and art perspective, coexistence would mean, in a sense, a recognition of a diversity of intelligences. And when I say the idea of localization, meaning, I suppose for me, this notion of intelligence and substrate, material substrate, being coupled, and there have been, what I'm saying in the question, I suppose, is there have been certain propositions, I suppose, in AI research of like sensory grounding, environmental coupling, or here the idea that Hinton brought up first, that there could be a coupling between of software and hardware that is unique and not universal. And I suppose for me the question is, does that, in your opinion, open up perhaps certain perspectives in AI research? Or I'm not sure if I even want to bring up AGI here. Yeah, I thought I meant the idea of localization, I suppose, as a, let's say, an environmental coupling, whichever we think would be an environment. Maybe it could be a hardware architecture.
So, yeah, I guess I'm still not quite sure I follow, but if I think about, what's the sort of default mental picture that we have of what a future AGI would be like, I think it's not sort of, a humanoid robot that carries its brain around in its head, right? Or in its chest or somewhere else, right? That's a very, very 1950s notion. Right? It's much more likely to be a global compute substrate. It may be, multiple distributed data centers around the world, and multiple sensors and multiple effectors, meaning sort of think of the robots as just appendages. So that one giant global brain, if you want, controlling hundreds of millions of physical robots that are doing its bidding around the world. And so in that sense, it's a physical entity with millions of perceptual input streams coming from all over the world, and millions of physical instantiations that are doing the work. So that way, so the physical robots are not cooperating with each other in the way that humans do, where we each have our own sensory inputs, and then we speak to each other to get communication and cooperation to happen, right? But they're cooperating in the same sense that, the fingers of my hand cooperate with each other, because they're all just controlled by one brain, even though each of them has their own sensory inputs. And they just cooperate much more seamlessly than as if it was two different people. So that's, I think that's the picture that most people have of how this would work. And if it is going to be localized, it would be for reasons of efficiency, that somehow you're better off not centralizing all the sensory input. And you can see arguments, right? So if some robots are on one building site in one country and some other robots are on another building site in another country, they don't need to cooperate with each other. And it might turn out just to be more efficient to have something that's more localized. But it's still, I think it's going to be giant data center with a number of these physical extensions rather than individual robots carrying their brains around. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've maybe one brief follow-up. The idea of, let's say, the idea of, because you brought up data earlier in the talk, and the and data sort of let's say maybe hitting a limit of how we can generate data, of how basically training data. And I was wondering that maybe too. I thought, could there be an approach where, let's say, certain certain let's say certain ways of environmental coupling, in a sense that we can gather from how humans actually learn, would that open up perspectives of how we can circumnavigate this the limitations that we're facing in terms of data?
So yeah, it's absolutely correct. I mean, humans learn from far less data. It's interesting when you get a picture book, it says A for apple, B for buffalo, blah, 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 G for giraffe. Right? There's one picture of a giraffe, and the child sees that one picture, and from then on, they can recognize giraffes anywhere in the world under any circumstances, all, backgrounds and lighting conditions and everything else, even though you've just shown them one little cartoon picture of a giraffe, right? You can't buy a picture book that has 38 million pictures of giraffes, which is what we use to train the AI systems. So there's something, in my view, fundamentally different happening in the human brain. So it's not the environmental coupling, it's the human brain. It's able to learn from far less data. And a clue comes from the example of learning to recognize a group of stones in Go, right? I mean, in English or in a programming language like Python, it's like 2 lines to describe what a group is, right? The stones that are connected to each other directly or indirectly by horizontal or vertical adjacency, right? So in Python, I can write that down in 2 lines. As a circuit, it requires, I don't know, probably tens of thousands of pages to correctly recognize groups of stones on a board of a fixed size. If you change the size of the board, you'd have to make the circuit much bigger, right? And a different circuit. Whereas the Python program or the English description remain the same size no matter how big the board is. So it's just, we call this expressive power. And the expressive power of programs is just much, much greater than the expressive power of these feed-forward circuits. And so if we could figure out how to learn program-like representations efficiently, then we could have the same data efficiency as humans. And this is, I would say, one of the big unsolved problems in computer science, is how to learn expressive representations effectively, right? We have dumb ways of doing it where you just try every possible 1-line program, every possible 2-line program, every possible 3-line program until you find one that agrees with all the training data. But that probably isn't going to work in the long run. That was a bit like what the Fortran guys were doing back in the 50s. So if we can come up with ways of doing that, then all the data requirements would drop by orders of magnitude, right? We're already using 1 million times more text than any human being has ever read, right? So there's clearly something wrong. But you can't convince, the deep learning guys that there's something wrong.
Thank you.
Perhaps we can just go to this question that is from YouTube. I mean, thank you, Michael. Just to say, we are spanning the world here today, Stuart. Michael is an artist and art theorist from Berlin who's doing a PhD in Hong Kong. And we have a question here from Carla Saldana, Saldana, who is an architect from Ecuador who did a PhD in ETH Zurich, and is now a professor at the University of Florida. Her question is this.
I'm going to be in Florida. I'm going to be at University of Florida next week. So come,
Oh, really?
come and
Oh,
say hello.
wow.
Yeah, I think I'm speaking on Friday. So yeah.
Many of the examples you presented involve maximizing or minimizing an existing threshold and looking for optimization. Suppose we plan for a control mechanism, which makes sense when applying AI tools to make decisions in complex situations. My question is, how can we use AI as an instrument for partners to reimagine new creative work if that system of control prevents the exploration? It's an interesting question. Did you get that? In the chat, if you can.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm reading it in the chat. So I guess the question is that there's a tension between a control mechanism and the utility of the system for us, particularly in having the system be able to do things that explore stuff that humans wouldn't have thought of. And I guess it shouldn't, there shouldn't be that tension. The idea of control is absolutely not to try to sort of build fences to constrain the behavior of the system, because that doesn't work. And in human compatible, I call this the loophole principle. And you know, for 6,000 years, we've been trying to constrain the behavior of economic actors by sort of building walls and saying, okay, you have to stay within this and this and this and this and this and this and to get people to pay their taxes. And we have totally failed. In fact, I think tax compliance is worse now than it's been for a while. And that's because relative to governments and people who write the tax law, the entities that are supposed to pay their taxes are more intelligent. They can afford much better lawyers than the government. And well, plus they also pay Congress people to write the laws. But this is the issue, right? The only way you can get more intelligent entities to pay their taxes is that the more intelligent entities want to pay their taxes. And so that's, in some sense, what the two principles, that the AI system is only pursuing the best interests of humans, that's the control mechanism. And that doesn't try to put fences on behavior. It doesn't say, well, the AI system is not allowed to do this, and it's not allowed to do that, and it's not allowed to do this other thing, because the AI system will, if it's not pursuing the best interests of humans, it will find ways to harm us that comply with all those rules, because it'll find a loophole in those rules that we try to write down. Whereas doing it this way, that its only objective is to further human interests, doesn't try to constrain in advance any particular behavior, but just puts the onus on the AI system to be sure that what it does is beneficial to us. And that would include giving us ideas that we would never have thought of, because our own brains are somewhat limited. You know, as long as those ideas are ideas that we will find ways to use to our benefit. So they might, for example, it might have ideas about much more effective ways to kill billions of people, but it might want to keep those a secret because it understands that we probably can't be trusted with methods like that.
Dude, I don't know how.
Question. If not, we can talk about it on Friday.
So I don't know if you've got. There are a couple more questions in the chat. I don't know how much time you have, but one of them is kind of, you almost, well, you answered this in some senses, but there's a question from Gustavo. Sorry, it's under, yeah. Gustavo's a question: what regulatory policy supporting reports have you been developing by governments or institutions that most aligns with your conclusions?
So I would say it's a really interesting question. The landscape of AI regulation is changing rapidly. It's very active, and it basically the government's kind of woke up early last year, sort of partly prompted by the emergence of ChatGPT and then GPT-4, and then the open letter from many AI researchers asking for a pause in developing more powerful systems until we could figure out how to regulate and control. And so governments, I think, have responded relatively quickly to this. They've held global summits, starting with the one in November of last year that took place in the UK, and then one in Korea. There's another one coming up in Paris in February. And then lots and lots of bilateral, like US-China discussions, US-India, US-UK, EU, all sorts of talks that are aimed at developing a common approach. And I think the common approach is really important. Having a piecemeal approach where different jurisdictions have very different ideas about how to regulate would be a disaster. So there are certain things in the European Union AI Act that I'm quite happy about. So the ban on the impersonation of human beings, meaning that you have a right to know if you're interacting with a machine or a human. I think that's really important. They also have a prohibition on manipulation of humans, which is a little hard to figure out how that's going to be operationalized, but I think that's also really important, and certain kinds of deepfakes. But those are all sort of piecemeal, and they don't really get to the major problem of systems that are increasingly capable that we don't know how to control. So California, the state assembly and Senate have passed a regulation, a bill. It's called SB 1047, which requires developers of systems above a certain scale to provide convincing evidence to regulators that their systems don't pose enormous risks. And the industry, that I think is the first real regulation that addresses this question. And the governor hasn't signed it yet. He has to sign it by the end of the month. So we're coming down to the wire. Later on today, I'm actually appearing on Fox News, at least I think I am, to talk about this. And some elements of the industry, not all, but some are pushing back very hard because, as I mentioned, they are, well, first of all, just allergic to regulation of any kind. They love the fact that they sit in highly regulated office buildings and they fly on highly regulated airplanes and they take highly regulated medicines, but they don't want any regulation applied to their products. But they also are terrified because they have no way to provide convincing evidence of safety, because they don't understand how their systems work. They cannot provide any high confidence statement about what it's going to do and what it's not going to do. And that's really the reason why they object so strongly. So that would be, I think, the one that's closest to what we want, but it's still quite weak. And we're going to have to try to get some of the red lines that I mentioned into legislation fairly soon.
Thank you, Stuart. It was an amazing lecture.
Thank you very much.
I'll second that. We've got a question from Deepti. You have time for this one? Deepti
This will be the last one.
Okay. Deepti is, I say, is an Indian architect and academic who's now in Copenhagen doing a PhD, but online in Florida. So you're spanning the world here today.
Wow. Okay.
Deepti, do you want to ask a question? I can read it out if you otherwise.
Yeah. Thank you, Stuart. It was your lectures are always very clear and very I think especially for people who don't know much about computation, and I really enjoyed your REIT lectures as well. And so my question, I think you partly answered it just now, because I was more of course, it's really important. I think you're trying to guide the future, which is not very far off in terms of AI. But I was more curious about what you think about current AI tools and how they're being used, and for example, with disinformation or deep fakes, and if I mean, it's not just the end, it's also the way you go to the end is also a question. And I was just wondering, what were your thoughts about the way current AI tools are being used?
Yeah, I think so. If we take deepfakes, they're partly regulated in the EU. They're not regulated in the US. Deepfake porn is regulated in the UK, but not in the US. And I'm not sure about the EU, whether that, I'm not sure if it covers it. But, clearly, these are just harms that are being inflicted on people because they can, and because regulators are either too timid or too confused or too corrupted to do anything about it. And obviously, we should try to fix that. So we've done big open letters on banning deepfake porn in the US, and so it's starting to happen. I think Taylor Swift was, was a good ally in that because she was a victim of it. Hillary Clinton told me that she was also a victim of that quite a few years ago when she was running for office. The Russians were producing deepfake porn of Hillary Clinton. So the disinformation is an issue. I think it's a threat to the structure of society, and it's not a new thing, but AI makes it much easier and cheaper to do it on a personalized, mass personalized scale. So I think it's probably having a huge effect, but it's almost impossible to measure because the companies that are disseminating it, namely the large social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, do not allow anyone to find out the scale of it. And in fact, they've deliberately disbanded the teams that were trying to find out the scale of it. Because their view is that if they had teams that were trying to find out, then they might be guilty if they failed. Whereas if they don't have a team, then they can just say, well, nothing to do with us. Right? We didn't know about it, so how could you blame us? Right? And it's a deliberate policy. There's no question that this is deliberately what they're doing. So I think transparency, allowing governments, I mean, even just, allowing the government to find out if their country is under attack by another country, right, would seem like a reasonable request. But at the moment, that's not possible. Furthermore, in the US, making a deepfake of Kamala Harris doing something that she never did and disseminating it the week before the election is completely legal. And the Supreme Court has said that we can't that any effort to stop that would be against the Constitution. So it's really going to be difficult to stop this as a matter of the government regulating that type of misuse. But you can think of this from another side, right? Could you make AI systems that would actually just refuse to do it? And that might be a direction that we could pursue. And to some extent, that's what they're trying to do with large language models that one of the training phases is called reinforcement learning from human feedback. And they try to teach the system not to answer questions like, how do I make a bomb? Or how do I commit suicide? Or any number of other questions that they think should not be answered. Unfortunately, that technique, which my colleagues don't like it when I say this, but it's basically spanking the system when it misbehaves, and hoping that it won't do it again. But of course, it does do it again. The UK AI Safety Institute just tested the 4 leading AI models, and said that it was trivial to circumvent the so-called guardrails that prevent these behaviors. And that's because we have no idea how these systems work, and so all we can do is spank them and hope that fixes the problem.
Okay. Chilling. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart. Can I just, before just make a brief comment to explain myself about the Wall-E comment? I was asked once by someone who said, well, if AI can do all the design for us, then we'll just switch off and do nothing. You know, that's what the Wall-E comment kind of suggests. And actually, what's happening is that the really imaginative designers are seizing upon these tools and saying, wow, what can we do with that? So I don't think it's going to shut down the human spirit. I think it's going to open up a new territory of exploration. That is, I mean, I'm optimistic about that anyway, but just to explain my comment.
Yeah, so but if you can design 1,000 amazing buildings before breakfast, how many buildings are we actually going to build, and how many architects are we going to need to do that? And then at some point, the AI system will say, I can do this better than Neil.
Yeah,
he can only do 1,000 buildings before breakfast, and I can do 1,000,000, and they're better than Neil's. It is I think it's still going to be an issue.
I'm no doubt about that, but I think the human spirit isn't. We have inquisitive minds, and we're not going to shut down. I don't think personally, anyway. But
I think some of us, yeah. But anyway, if you can think of a world that, in fact, there's a competition right now to make little short film describing a positive vision of the future with AI. So
I think you've only got to look at Instagram, where all these designers and architects and artists are just throwing out their ideas, and there's a kind of debate that's going on. Not everyone's on Instagram, of course, but no, I'm an optimist in the end. I think that it's going to open up huge areas. I'm not sure if it's going to be financially remunerated. I mean, when you put stuff on Instagram, you get nothing for it, but people want to be part of the debate and to contribute in some ways. Anyway, that's. Stuart, let's wrap this up. This was an absolutely beautiful lecture. It was a model lecture of clarity and information. I think it was incredibly useful. And I think you already made forays into the world of, let's say, the visual from your documentary Slaughterbots and so on. And I hope that even more your work will become central to debates going on in art, architecture, and design, not least because your son is studying design. But I think this was thank you so much for your generosity of spirit. This is really what Digital Future is all about, trying to share our passion for ideas across the world. And this is a perfect example of it. And thank you for getting up so early in the morning in California. Thank you, Stuart. And
great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Neil.
Many thanks. Many thanks.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Let me just finish off with our jingle at the end. Okay. Okay. Okay, here we go. So thank you, Stuart, and thank you everyone for joining us on YouTube and on Zoom. We will be posting this on our Digital Futures YouTube channel. Thank you.